the help was the small things, the little things, mostly the contact, the shaking hands, the untouchable. It was quite important to shake hands and have that sort of politeness and respect for people. Because they were living on the streets, things like having a clean, dry pair of socks is almost impossible. Their shoes usually were modern trainer-type shoes, which are the least effective when you're living on the streets. Very quickly start to let in water. Wearing damp socks with no way of drying them out, washing them, changing them, became a really big issue. We bought washing machines and dryers and so on, so that we would they were washing all the time. They're the clothes to keep people as sorted out as possible, and huge donations of clothing, particularly socks. Their feet were in a dreadful state. There were many occasions where somebody would come in for the first time, they'd heard about us, they'd been introduced, and they would turn up hobbling horribly. And it became almost a routine, a big washing up bowl full of warm water with antiseptic in, and we would bathe their feet, normally starting off with their socks on, so that they would become moist enough so that I could cut them off. And it was like First World War soldiers with trench foot in some cases, really dreadful. And we would get through comfortably 1,000 pairs of socks a year, as we were handing out clean, fresh socks. And we ended up having to get a contract on a skip for all the dirty and disgusting clothes we were getting rid of. As a vicar, it is not just the physical needs and so on, it's the pastoral care. The most important thing we sought to do with the community, which is why I always insisted that people would come in, and when they were comfortable, when they discovered a bit of self-confidence, they would be encouraged to volunteer to be able to serve the other people in the community. For whatever reason, when you lose your home, you also lose a huge amount of self-confidence and self-esteem. And it was our absolute priority to rebuild that, because however much material and physical support you gave, without also building up that self-esteem, confidence and hope.
He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus replied, "You do not realize what I am doing, but later you will understand." "No," said Peter, "you shall never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me." "Then, Lord," Simon Peter replied, "not just my feet, but my hands and my head as well." Jesus answered, "Those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean, and you are clean, though not every one of you." For he knew who was going to betray him, and that was why he said not everyone was clean. When he had finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. "Do you understand what I have done for you?" he asked them. "You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet."
He sat outside the local village shop with his dog. We just finished our food shop. This was my first time. I saw him, but I was too young to understand. I still don't, to this day. What are those consequences? The endless cycle of non-routine. I wouldn't blame them. He went into the shop and ate a bag of crisps. He did not pay. The shopkeeper was willing to call the police, but my mum stopped and paid for them herself. She told the man to stay put. Mum took my brother and I back to the house and told us to unpack the food shop. She made some sandwiches and she went off. She went back to the man. She gave him the sandwiches and some money for his dog and told him to stay somewhere, such as a shelter, for safety and feed his dog. He nodded and they departed. 5 minutes later, my mum went back to get her cigarettes that she forgot to get, and he was in there using the money for alcohol. She was furious. She snatched back the money back and went back. I guess the dog had enough too.
By the time a year had gone by, we were talking about 40, 50, 60 people coming on a Sunday evening. Various churches and various suppliers had rallied round, and it had become a really important point of people's weeks, not just the homeless, but that hidden homeless, the vulnerably housed, the people who are sofa surfing, and also a significant number of people who were isolated, alone, marginalised in some way or another, and a community was formed. It was at that stage that Bishop Tim said, we need someone to lead this and make the church something more appropriate, rather than just a derelict place. And that's when he found me as a sort of recently qualified to be a vicar, former army officer, and said, do you fancy this challenge? And I said, do I just? Yes, fantastic. And we created a formal partnership between Beatitude and the parish of St Mary the Wigford. And they moved in and took over the church hall as their base. They had an office here. We employed specialist support workers, and we ran very successfully. The whole principle of Beatitude was underpinned by the rule of Benedict. We would welcome people as if they were Christ. Everybody was welcome. If, however, they were drunk, they were violent or something, we also followed the rule of Benedict, and the punishments and the exclusions followed that pathway. Everything was based upon you come here and you participate.
Very truly, I tell you, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them.
Every time I saw them, I was hesitant. Should I or shouldn't I? They may get angry, I may upset them, for they are human after all. My brother tried to stay outside for 48 hours because he wanted to understand more of the experience of being homeless. Part of me was angry at him for that I felt he was abusing his privileges, but part of me was also envy of him for that I should do the same too. Even though he did not last long, I wouldn't blame him why. It kind of makes sense. While being in the cold all day, the endless non-routine, shivering in pain, and that fatigue and hunger, I wouldn't be surprised if they started to use the abuse, the abusive highs, and the intoxicating alcohol. They'll forget the shivers. So,
It all began when a man called Conrad turned up at the church. It was empty at the time, and a group of people were meeting, including the former Bishop of Grantham, Tim Ellis, and a colleague, or a person who later became a colleague, called the Reverend Liz Jackson. They were talking about holding a special rock Eucharist in the church. Because it was an empty place, the oldest church in Lincoln, we wanted to find a new use for it. And God provided. Conrad turned up with all of his life, all of his personal possessions in 2 plastic bags, and asked for a cup of coffee. It was a late Sunday night. The meeting was largely done anyway, so they made him a cup of coffee and started talking and finding out about his life as a homeless man on the streets in Lincoln. We discovered a very interesting thing at that time. On Sundays, all the normal facilities are shut, and it's one of the worst days of the week for homeless people. So Liz struck a deal. She said, all right then, Conrad, if you bring your mates round next Sunday, I will get some food. The kitchen here is not too bad, and we will gather it all together. You'll cook it, you'll do the washing up, and we'll enjoy decent food and conversation. So Reverend David Edgar, Reverend Liz Jackson acquired some food. Quite a number of people turned up, a dozen. I wasn't there at the time. And they had a wonderful evening, and within a fortnight or so we were getting 20 or 30 people coming along. And Bishop Tim said, this is a good thing, it has my blessing, and created with Liz Jackson an organisation called Beatitude. She was doing work on the Millennium Development Goals, but this was a special project he created in response to that need. It still happened in this lovely old abandoned church.
And bring the homeless poor into your house, when you see the naked, to cover him, and not to hide yourself from your own flesh. Turning toward the women, he said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears, and wiped them with her hair.
He sat on a bench in a little green island just before Steep Hill. I just finished viewing a live show, and frankly I was tired and done. And I sat on the next bench next to him, procrastinating in silence, until I asked a question. What is your name? It was a small mumble. I think he was nervous, or more if he just didn't want to know. But he said his name was Ian. I kept saying that I'm sorry if I'm disturbing you. But he just said it's fine. And then I went to a straight question, pretty much blunt, almost rude, but I was just so curious. I asked, why is a man like you out here every night? Why aren't you with the rest of the lot further down, but you're up here? He shrugged his shoulders and he said he preferred it here. It's quiet. You can actually sleep. I tried to ask other questions, such as why have you become in this state? What was the cause? And he just shrugged his shoulders. I didn't want to try and make any more conversation with him. I felt rude enough anyway. So I said thank you and have a good night. And I walked away.
Many had significant issues. There was a time in 2010 when the snow fell deep and crisp and very uneven on Lincoln, and there were 56 East European migrants living down on Stamp End in various camps. They were here on hourly paid contracts, working in the fields and so on. But when the weather was bad, there was no harvesting. They were unemployed. They would lose their accommodation very quickly because there was no guaranteed contract with the farmers. It was all through agencies. Some of the agencies weren't very good, and these were the most vulnerable of them all. And they could only survive by shoplifting and all sorts of other problems. They were a big issue to the county council, city council, and the police and so on. Anyway, when the snow came, there was a bit of a panic because they would have died in those conditions. So the Nomad Trust said, well, we can't cope. We are bursting at the seams. And in the space of about 4 hours, Liz Jackson and I, working with Nomad, working with the city council, turned the whole of the church hall into a dormitory for them, their home. And they all moved in, and it was a really challenging, exciting time. But it had a wonderful effect on community cohesion, because the Eastern European homeless and the British homeless did not always get to know each other and meet, and so it ended up really, it was a wonderful exercise in bringing people together. And of course it got all these people off the streets, and those camps have never reappeared. We then started doing breakfasts as well, and a wonderful local butcher provided huge amounts of meat at no cost. We had a wonderful man who was a hairdresser say, well, I will come along and we'll do the hairdressing. And clothes were being delivered by all sorts of churches. And there would be things where one of them had a dreadful accident, really bad accident. We did not think he would survive. Because he was no fixed abode, the county hospital immediately phoned us, said, we've just had this person admitted. His skull had been really smashed and fractured in very many ways. He was taken to Sheffield, and we phoned his next of kin, because whilst he'd been in our community, we got to know lots about him. We replaced his passport and so on. And we put out a call saying we would like some money because we want his mother and his sister to be able to fly to UK and be at his bedside. And they were desperate to come. And bless him, he survived, dear Pavel. And I met them at the airport, drove them. It was wonderful at the hospital how when you reach out to people in the right way, the support they get is fantastic.
John 13:3-5. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come forth from God and was going back to God, got up from supper, and laid aside his garments, and taking a towel, he girded himself. Then he poured water into the basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. Luke 22:26-27. But is not this way with you? But the one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant. For who is greater, the one who reclines at the table, or the one who serves? Is it not the one who reclines at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves.
He always sits there, on that green island, from late afternoon and probably till dawn, but I never see him in the day. It was a coincidence if I did, or just partly seeing him, until one day I sat on the bench next to him, drinking my coffee. I was worried he might recognise me, but he must have forgotten me, for that it was weeks ago. A cat came by, scratching its back around the trees and nuzzling the bark. Childish as I am, I wanted to pet the cat, and I called for it. However, it did not come. Instead, it kept circling around the green island, and then it decided to sniff and muzzle Ian's boots. A bald man in sandals came by, with a plate of sandwiches and a bowl of cat food. The bell rang from the cat's collar and followed the sandal man's ankles around. He passed some sandwiches to Ian and the bowl to the cat, and the sandal man just sat next to him. He just talked about his day, what he had to do at work, who's annoyed him, and if the sandwiches were okay. From my experience with Ian, he did not make much comments. He said that the sandwiches are fine, and that he's sorry that he had to go through such a thing today. And the cat just carried on eating his food. To me, it looked like the sandal man gave some humanity. Just a small routine, but a good enough one to remember. Almost he's befriended him. Even if it's not much, there's still something. Something a little bit more than... even a little bit more than passing a cigarette in the middle of the night. Or giving them some change. He had company at the end of the night. A home that you can always call a home, a space that two people that actually care sit down with him and eat dinner, even if it's just sandwiches and cat food. The company of the sandal man, the cat, the sandwiches, and an observer with a coffee.